He called her the burden. Not to her face, not always, but in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. In the heavy sigh that escaped his lips when he saw her swollen belly, a constant, growing reminder of a union that had ended in a shallow grave on the prairie and left him with one more mouth to feed. Now, that mouth was about to become two. She stood beside her father, Jebediah, in the biting wind of the high desert trading post, a place that smelled of dust, unwashed bodies, and cheap whiskey. She was 22, but the sun and the sorrow had carved 32 years into her face. Men appraised her like livestock, their eyes lingering on her condition with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was used goods. Damaged. A poor investment. Her gaze remained fixed on the scuffed toes of her boots. To look up was to meet their judgment, and her own shame was a heavy enough stone to carry. Her father's voice was a loud, grating thing, a tool he used to carve out space in the world. "She's a good worker," he boomed to the lean, hard-faced proprietor of the post. "Strong back." Just this complication, he gestured vaguely at her stomach. The proprietor just grunted, polishing a glass with a dirty rag. No one wanted a pregnant woman whose husband was dead. She was a ghost at a feast, a debt with no hope of repayment. She closed her eyes, praying to be invisible, to be anywhere else. Then, another man approached. He did not move with the shuffling, aggressive gait of the settlers or trappers. He moved like a shadow, silent and deliberate. He was Modoc, his dark hair long and bound by a simple leather cord, his face a mask of stoic calm that seemed to absorb the noisy desperation of the post and render it inert. He looked at her father, then his eyes, dark and unreadable, settled on her. She flinched, expecting the same leering assessment, the same dismissal. But he did not look at her belly. He did not look at the worn-out fray of her dress or the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He looked at her face, for a single, piercing moment. It felt as if he were seeing past the grime and the grief, into the small, flickering ember of a person she had forgotten existed. Her father, seeing a potential customer, launched into his sales pitch again. "Take her off my hands. A winter's worth of pelts, maybe some cured meat. She's got another man's child in her, but she's serviceable." The word hung in the air, vile and sharp. The Modoc man did not respond to Jebediah. He continued to look at her. Then, he spoke, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to her father's bluster. He spoke not in his own tongue, but in the trader's broken English, so there would be no misunderstanding. "I will take her," he said. He laid a heavy bundle of prime beaver pelts on the counter, more than a fair trade for a season's supplies, let alone for a single unwanted woman. Jebediah's eyes widened in greedy surprise. The deal was struck without another word from him. Her father grabbed a sack of flour, his hand shaking slightly with avarice. He didn't look at her. He didn't say goodbye. He simply turned and walked away, his back straight, the burden finally lifted from his shoulders. She was left standing in the dust, traded for furs and flour, a piece of property passed from one owner to another. The Modoc man gestured with his head for her to follow. As she took her first hesitant step away from everything she had ever known, a whisper from one of the trappers reached her ear, dripping with scorn. "What's he want with a used-up, pregnant white girl?" The post proprietor, counting the pelts, didn't look up. He just shrugged. "Cale's a strange one. He said she was sent by the spirits." A sign, the trapper snorted in derision. But she heard it. A sign. Not a burden. A sign. The word was a foreign seed planted in the barren soil of her soul. She followed the silent man out of the wretched noise of the post and into the vast, waiting silence of the wilderness. They walked for what felt like an eternity. Cale, walked a few paces ahead, his stride even and unhurried, yet she struggled to keep up. The land was harsh, a canvas of sagebrush and stone under a relentless, unforgiving sky. Her ankles swelled, and a dull ache settled deep in her back. Each step was an act of will. She expected him to grow impatient, to bark at her, to grab her arm and drag her along. Her father would have. Her late husband, a man of quick temper and quicker fists, certainly would have. But Cale did not. When she stumbled, he would simply stop and wait, his back to her, granting her the dignity of recovering on her own. He never offered a hand, but he offered her time, and she soon learned that was a far greater gift. The silence between them was a living thing. At first, it was a terrifying void, filled with all her fears. She was alone with a stranger, a man her people called a savage. He could abandon her. He could harm her. He could do anything he wanted, and no one would ever know. Her mind screamed with 1,000 panicked warnings. But the violence never came. The cruelty never surfaced. Instead, there was nothing. Just the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the dry earth, the whisper of the wind, and the patient, steady presence of the man walking ahead. He was a creature of observation and action. He would halt suddenly, his body going still, and a moment later she would see what he had seen, a hawk circling high overhead, the distant tracks of a deer, a patch of edible root she would have walked right past. He moved through the world as if he were a part of it, not a trespasser upon it. He found water in places that looked hopelessly arid. He would light a fire with an efficiency that seemed like magic. He would hand her a piece of cooked rabbit or a strip of dried meat without a word, his face impassive. He never ate until she had. This small, repeated act of deference was so alien to her experience that it felt like a shout in the crushing silence. Men ate first. Men took the best portions. That was the rule. Cale lived by a different code, one she could not decipher but was beginning, desperately, to trust. One evening, as a cold front moved in, he shrugged off his own heavy buckskin cloak and draped it over her shoulders. It smelled of pine smoke, leather, and him. It was heavy and warm, a shield against the biting wind. She clutched it around herself, her hands trembling. It was the first act of gentle, unsolicited care she had received in years. She looked at his back, at the simple cotton shirt that was now his only protection against the cold, and a crack formed in the wall of ice around her heart. That night, her dreams were not of her husband's angry face or her father's dismissive sneer. She dreamt of a silent forest, of the feeling of a warm cloak, and of the steady, quiet rhythm of a man who walked ahead, clearing a path. He was not leading her into captivity. He was leading her toward a sanctuary she couldn't yet imagine. She began to notice his hands. They were strong and calloused, the hands of a man who lived by his own labor, but they were also incredibly deft. In the evenings, by the fire's light, he would often take a small piece of wood and a knife and begin to carve. He worked slowly, with intense concentration, the shavings falling away to reveal a shape within the wood. She would watch, mesmerized, as the form of an animal emerged. A hawk. A wolf. A bear. He never spoke of what he was doing. He simply did it. The act itself seemed to be a form of communion, a quiet conversation between him and the wood, the fire, the night. His home was not a teepee or a crude lean-to, as she might have imagined. It was a small, sturdy cabin built into the side of a hill, overlooking a river that cut a deep green swath through the tawny landscape. It was a place of profound peace. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, and she realized he had prepared this place. He had known he was bringing her here. Inside, it was sparse but clean. Furs were piled on a raised sleeping platform, and a stone hearth dominated one wall. He gestured to a smaller, separate platform he had clearly built for her, a space that was hers alone. He gave her privacy without her having to ask. He gave her respect without her having to earn it. He simply gave it. The days fell into a gentle rhythm. He would leave at dawn to hunt or check his traps, and she would tend to the cabin. She swept the packed earth floor, mended his spare shirt with thread she painstakingly made from sinew, and learned to cook with the ingredients the forest provided. These were not commands he gave her, they were tasks she chose, small ways to contribute, to feel less like a burden and more like a partner in this quiet life. She was learning his language, not of words, but of actions. A piece of fresh honeycomb left on the table meant he was thinking of her. The driest wood piled by the hearth was an act of care. His presence was a promise of safety. One afternoon, while she was washing clothes in the river, a white man, a grizzled trapper with mean eyes, appeared on the opposite bank. He saw her, and a vulgar grin split his face. "Well, well," he called out, his voice a violation of the tranquility. "Look what the savage has got himself. You lost, little lady." She froze, the wet fabric clutched in her hands, the old fear returning like a cold sickness. She didn't answer, just lowered her gaze to the water. The man started to wade across the shallow river, his intentions clear in his predatory stare. And then Cale was there. He seemed to materialize from the trees behind her, silent as smoke. He held no weapon. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stood, feet planted, his arms crossed over his chest. His stillness was more menacing than any weapon. He looked at the trapper, and the trapper looked back. The air crackled with unspoken challenge. The trapper hesitated, his bravado faltering under that silent, unwavering gaze. He muttered a curse, turned, and retreated back across the river, disappearing into the woods. Cale did not move until the man was long gone. Then, he turned to her. He looked at her frightened face, at her trembling hands. For the first time, a flicker of something she could almost name, concern, maybe even anger on her behalf, crossed his features. He reached out, not to touch her, but to a small, smooth river stone at her feet. He picked it up and handed it to her. It was warm from the sun. An anchor. A simple, solid thing. She took it, her fingers curling around its weight. That night, he finished a new carving. He had been working on it for weeks. He approached her as she sat by the fire, mending. He knelt before her and held it out on his open palm. It was an otter, sleek and fluid, its head turned as if looking back to protect something. In its mouth, it held a tiny, perfectly carved fish. He said nothing. He just offered it. She understood. The otter was a fierce protector of its young. A strong swimmer, navigating the dangerous currents of the river. He saw her not as a burden, but as this creature, resilient, protective, and about to bring new life into the world. Tears welled in her eyes, the first she had shed not from sorrow, but from a gratitude so profound it hurt. She took the carving, her fingers tracing its smooth lines. "Elara," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "My name is Elara." He gave a slow, single nod, as if he had known it all along. "Elara," he repeated. Her name, spoken by him, sounded like a prayer. The first snows had just begun to dust the high peaks when the child decided to arrive. It was a long and difficult birth, with only the crackling fire and Cale's quiet presence for company. He did not panic. He boiled water, brought her clean clothes, and sat just outside the curtained-off area of her sleeping platform, a silent, unmoving guardian. His steadiness was her strength. When the first cry of her son echoed in the small cabin, a sound both terrifying and miraculous, she felt a wave of relief so powerful it left her shaking. Cale entered, his eyes going first to her, then to the small, red-faced infant in her arms. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing the stoicism and revealing a deep, gentle warmth she had only ever glimpsed. He had built a cradle while she was in labor, a perfect, sturdy thing of bent willow and soft rabbit fur. He placed it beside her bed. He had prepared for this. He had accepted this child as his own from the very beginning. Her son. Their son. They named him River, for the water that gave them their life. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and a fierce, primal love she had never known. Cale was a natural father. He would hold the baby, his large, rough hands impossibly gentle, and hum low, ancient melodies that always seemed to soothe him. He was a provider, a protector, a partner. She, Elara, was no longer a ghost. She was a woman, a mother. She was loved. She was home. This peace, she knew, was a fragile thing. The world outside their sanctuary had not forgotten them. One afternoon, as River slept in his cradle and she ground corn outside the cabin, she heard the sound of approaching horses. It was not Cale's light, familiar footstep. It was heavy, clumsy. 2 riders emerged from the trees. Her heart seized. It was her father, Jebediah, and with him, her older brother, Thomas. Her father's face was a thundercloud of self-righteous fury. He had come to reclaim his property. "So, this is where you've been," he bellowed, his voice desecrating the quiet air. "Living in filth with a savage. We're taking you back." And the boy, Thomas, a paler, weaker version of his father, nodded in agreement, though he wouldn't meet her eyes. Elara slowly got to her feet, her body a shield in front of the cabin door. "This is my home," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You have no right. Jebediah scoffed, dismounting. "I am your father. That child is my blood. I'll not have my grandson raised by a heathen. He'll be a worker on my land," as God intended. He took a step toward her. Just then, Cale emerged from the forest, a brace of rabbits in his hand. He stopped, taking in the scene. He dropped the rabbits and moved to stand beside Elara, not in front of her, but at her shoulder. A partner. He said nothing. He simply stood with her. His presence was all she needed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by something else, a righteous fire. This man, this silent, gentle man, had saved her. This child was her heart. This life was hers. She would not let it be taken. She looked her father in the eye, the shame he had branded on her soul now burned away by the heat of her love. "No," she said. The word was not a plea. It was a statement. A wall. "This is my home. This is my son. This is my husband. You gave me away, remember? I was a burden. Well, the burden has found her place. You will not take him. You will not take me." Jebediah's face turned purple with rage. "You dare speak to me, go," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Leave this place and do not return." Her brother shifted nervously, looking from his furious father to the unmoving Modoc and the woman he no longer recognized. He saw no victim. He saw a queen defending her realm. Her father sputtered, his authority shattered against the simple, unshakable power of their unity. He looked at Cale's calm, resolute face, and at his daughter's fierce, protective glare. He saw two people, one heart. He had no power here. With a final, venomous curse, Jebediah mounted his horse. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "You'll come crawling back." But Elara knew she never would. She watched them ride away, their presence dissolving back into the forest, leaving only peace behind them. Cale placed his hand on her shoulder, a rare and powerful touch. She leaned into it, drawing strength. She had found her voice. She had claimed her life. She was free. Life by the river flowed on, marked by the turning of the seasons. River grew from a baby into a boy with his mother's bright eyes and his father's quiet, observant nature. He learned the names of the trees and the tracks of the animals. He learned to fish with a small spear Cale carved for him and to find the sweetest berries with his mother. Elara's cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home, filled with the smell of baking bread, the sound of a child's laughter, and a profound, bone-deep peace. The scars of her past had not vanished, but they had faded, transformed from open wounds into faint, silvery lines that told a story of survival, not of shame. She had learned Cale's language, the spoken Modoc words that were as melodic as his humming, but more importantly, she had mastered the language of his heart. She knew his rare smiles were reserved for her and their son. She knew the gentle touch of his hand on her hair as she slept was a poem of love more eloquent than any sonnet. His love was not a tempest, it was a deep, steady river, constant and life-giving. He had never once said the words, "I love you." He didn't have to. He showed her every day in the firewood he chopped, the food he provided, the safety he guaranteed, and the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. He had not taken in a burden, he had recognized a soul. He had seen the otter spirit in her, the resilience and strength she never knew she possessed. He had loved her not in spite of her pregnancy, her sorrow, or her past, but because of the strength it took to endure them. One day, a young woman stumbled out of the forest, thin and terrified, fleeing a life of cruelty in a settlement downriver. She had heard whispers of a place of sanctuary, a cabin by the river where a white woman lived with a Modoc man. Ilara saw the same fear in the girl's eyes that she had once seen in her own reflection. Without hesitation, she brought the girl inside, gave her food and water, and wrapped her in a warm blanket. Cale watched from the doorway, his face unreadable but for the deep pride in his eyes. He saw his wife, no longer the shamed outcast, but a beacon of hope for others. She was not just surviving, she was a source of strength, a matriarch of their small, unconventional family. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in hues of gold and rose, Ilara rested her head on Cale's shoulder. She held the small, smooth otter carving in her hand, its form now familiar and comforting. She had been sold for being old and pregnant, a thing to be discarded. But the spirits, or fate, or simply the quiet wisdom of a good man, had intervened. She had been found. She had been seen for who she was, a woman of immense strength, capable of boundless love. He had not rescued a victim. He had simply welcomed home a queen who had forgotten she owned a crown. She was loved because of who she was, not in spite of it, and in that simple, profound truth, she had found her salvation. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Timeless Echoes. If you had seen her there at that trading post, abandoned and afraid, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.